Now, the Druids are a little bit of a shadowy organisation. They were effectively obliterated by the Romans when they invaded Britain in 43 AD. And their headquarters on Ynys Môn, which is Anglesey, was destroyed, and all their shrines were destroyed. The archdruid, the head druid, was killed, and all of his colleagues there. Now, what we know about the Druids, probably, I think, it's only my own opinion, people in France probably wouldn't agree, but I think our best evidence really about the Druids is Julius Caesar. Now, it's true that he was a fanatical enemy really of the Druids and of the Celtic tribes, and he killed 1 million people in Gaul and enslaved another 1 million. So you might think that he got a kind of biased view about the Druids, but actually he actually knew a Druid called Carcus. It's the only Druid whose name we actually know from history. And he became a great friend of Julius Caesar and Cicero, the poet, in whose house he resided in Rome. And from what Caesar tells us, there are some sort of important things he says about, you know, the basis of the Druidic religion. And this is what he says. He says, the cardinal doctrine which they seek to inculcate is that souls do not die, but after death pass from one body to another, and they discourse upon the stellar movements, the size of the universe, and of the measurement of the earth, the order of nature, and the potency and power of the immortal gods. The poet Lucan in his Pharsalia says that Caesar located a sanctuary of the Gauls outside Marseille, where tree trunks had been formed into effigies of the gods. These he felled, but only one with supreme courage would dare to venture therein. Here barbarous rites are practised in honour of the gods, and the altars are sprinkled with human blood. The people never venture to worship very near it, but leave it to the gods. The priest himself dreads to approach and fears to come upon the lord of the grove. Now, later on, in the 3rd century, philosophers, Greek philosophers mainly, in the city of Alexandria, became quite obsessed about the Druids, and they kind of reinvented them and made them sound as if they were kind of almost like we would think of Eastern mystics, you know, kind of harmless intellectuals, and that's what they were. They were a caste of intellectuals. You were born into the Druidic caste. It was hereditary, and these Druids were kind of reinvented, as I say, in a sort of soft way hundreds of years later. But the reputation that the early Roman writers, had of them is that they were savages. Now, this is an actual Latin word. Silva means a wood. And for the Romans, people who dwelt in the forests of northern Europe were considered barbaric, uncivilized, and so they were considered to be, quite dark characters. Now, J.G. Fraser, this is a scholar from Victorian times who studied these matters, tells us that it was a practice among the Celts to reserve the execution of condemned criminals so that they could be sacrificed at a great festival which took place on a quinquennial basis, that's every 5 years. If the number of confined criminals proved insufficient, prisoners of war were taken to make up the requisite numbers. Some were shot to death with arrows, some impaled on wooden stakes, but for others there was a grimmer fate even than this. Colossal images of wickerwork or wood and grass were constructed. These were filled with live men, cattle and animals of other kinds. Fire was then applied to the images, and they were burned with their living contents. The gigantic images constructed of osiers or covered with grass in which the Druids enclosed their victims reminds us of the leafy framework in which the human representative of the tree spirit is still so often encased. Now, some Celtic enthusiasts would demur and say that, you know, these practices were not common, and that the Celts were very far from being barbarians. And I think I agree. But on the other hand, we do have evidence that these human sacrifices did take place, and we regularly find the bodies of sacrificial victims who were strangled first, then their skulls beaten in with a club, and then finally stabbed and then thrown in, usually into a marshland or fen, where their bodies regularly turn up. To this day, I've seen one in Ireland which still had the hair attached, you know, a red-headed man he was. So these things went on, but I think now it's time to sort of turn to what kind of things Druids actually did. So if we can go on to the next. Yeah. So what did they do? Well, it was quite a lot of things, really. They were doctors, not only of medicine, but of all manner of natural philosophy. They were supremely intellectual, respected all over the world. The Greeks and Romans were aware of their capacities. A Greek who lived amongst the Galatians, which were a Celtic tribe who lived in what is now Turkey, Dion Chrysostom, he lived among them, and he had visited India. And one of the things he observed was how remarkably similar the Druids were to the Brahmin caste in India. And I reckon if we want a kind of comparator in the modern world, look to that as you know, a kind of template. They were very similar to those kind of Hindu priests in India today. They were diviners all over Britain and Ireland. To this day, objects are discovered which would have been used primarily to divine omens. We find these rods that they used, a bit like yarrow sticks, where they would throw these rods on the ground, and from the way they fell, certain conclusions would be drawn. Other things have been found where it seems that people's blood would be extracted and put into a little vessel, and from the way the blood fell into the quadrants within the little vessel, the same kinds of conclusions would be drawn. They were astrologers, and obviously they were aware that the planets move in predictable motions, and form, strangely enough, geometrical designs in the sort of in the heavens, and they were obsessed with the idea that the power that moved these planets, which they considered to be gods, literally god forms, was you know, what they were trying to get into rapport with, I guess is how you put it. They were spirit mediums, and this was one of their primary functions, was to contact not only the spirits of the deceased, but also god forms, which would literally incarnate to them, you know, and actually they would communicate with these god forms. They were lawyers and had responsibility for all manner of sort of jurisprudence and justice at regular you know, meetings of courts which met May Day, Beltane, and later on at Samhain, you know, what we call Halloween, twice a year, these courts. They were linguists. They didn't write anything down. This was simply a matter of secrecy for them, because knowledge, their sacred knowledge, they didn't want this communicated in written form. But they could speak Greek and Latin and could communicate, you know, with people across the seas. They were interpreters. They acted as politicians as well. These people were the people who advised the nobility. Their status in society was superior to that of, say, a king or a queen or any other nobility. They had special privileges, the Druids. It was a very privileged occupation. For one thing, you didn't need to do any military service at all for life. You were exempt from that. The other thing you were exempt from was tax. No taxes. The other thing you could do that other people couldn't do, in the Iron Age at least, was you could travel. They could go anywhere they liked, and nobody could, you know, sort of arrest them or question them or detain them or anything like that. If they crossed a battlefield during a battle, people put their weapons down until they got. They officiated at communal sacrifices, and this is really their most important function. Now, in the 18th century, when the Druids were kind of reinvented yet again by antiquarians in Britain, they were regularly referred to as a priesthood. Now, that isn't what they were. You know, this was not the Church of England. You know, what they actually did was they were there to supervise these sacrifices and make sure everything was done in order. And the most venerable of the Druids were the ones that looked after all this and ensured everything was done correctly. They were obviously teachers and intellectuals, and that was, you know, what they did. Historians, this was one of their primary functions, was, you know, as historians, storytellers. They were gleemen and musicians. They acted, particularly female Druids, there were female Druidesses. They acted as what were known as soul friends. So they would befriend people who were beleaguered in emotional trouble or physical trouble, and ensure that they, you know, kind of survived their traumas. And that reputedly they were wizards and magicians. And this was one of the things that frightened the Romans particularly. They wanted to eradicate the Druid cult because they feared that they literally could use enchantment or invoke storms, say to wreck a fleet if it were at sea, control the weather. They were supposed to be able to do all manner of things. So, and much more, yeah. I mean, these people were ubiquitous, and, you know, they had many functions. You might think, well, isn't that an awful lot to be doing? So if we could, well, it is really. And so, what they did was they divided these responsibilities into three separate orders. So, the first order, really, the outer order of the Druids, were known as bardoi, bards, and these people were in every community and were, you know, really the historian. If we go back, I'll just tell you which one bards actually did. They tended to do these things, you know, storytellers, historians. That was their kind of thing, musicians, poets, and things of that sort. So these other ones, the next in rank, the ovates, tended to be doing these other things, these mystical things, astrology, spiritual mediumship, divination, and all that sort of stuff. And the actual druids, the kind of top of the tree, if you like, were the ones that did, you know, were judges, lawyers, and things of that sort, and advised kings and queens. Yeah, so each one of these orders was symbolised by a tree. Some people think that the Druids worshipped trees. They didn't worship trees as such. They worshipped among trees in groves. And the tree really symbolised sort of deeper spiritual realities for them. The bardic tradition was symbolised by the birch tree. And ovates were symbolised by the yew tree. And finally, these druids, I mean, the word actually means, it means oak knower or oak seer. So the city of, say, Derry in Northern Ireland, that word, it just means an oak grove. You know, so that's where we get to. Now, the druids, if we move on now, we'll come back to them in a little while, because I think Elaine, when she booked this last year, was it last summertime, mentioned that, you know, are there any local connections to the Druids? Well, we'll come to that shortly. But I just want to get now to sort of into the kind of political geography of this area, going back to the time of the Druids. Now, forget that word at the top there, that strange looking word beginning with a H, we'll come back to that. But if you look on this map, the local tribe around here, the Celtic tribe, which would have had their own local druids, were called the Dobunii. And they occupied really the whole Severn Valley area. So Gloucestershire and Worcestershire was their tribal heartland. They actually divided that area into two sub-kingdoms. So Gloucestershire was based around, literally around Gloucester, which they called Glui, Caer Glui, and Worcestershire got a separate ruler, and they were based at Caer Wrydon, which is Worcester. And if you look right on the sort of extreme northern bit of the map there, you'll see that the tribal border is right here where we are. And that's quite important. So this was a fairly prosperous tribe, did well for itself. When the Romans turned up, they adopted their settlements and made them into, you know, colonial towns, which still exist. So we've got Bath, which is Aquae Sulis. You've got Cirencester, which is Corinium Doginiorum, which is the tribal capital. Obviously, Gloucester and Worcester became Roman settlements as well. Vertis was Worcester. This area, you know, was cultivated and civilized during the Roman period. If we move on, when the Romans left, as I said, they destroyed the Druidic cult sanctuary on Anglesey. But that didn't mean that the Druids were totally eradicated, because although they destroyed the universities, as it were, of these places, which they called Bangors. The biggest one was at a place called Bangor-on-Dee, up on Dee side there, and another one obviously opposite Anglesey at Bangor. They did wipe out the kind of the head druids and the ovates, but these bars were still extant in large parts of Britain. And of course, large parts of Britain never actually fell under Roman control at all. Ireland, you know, just was never touched by the Romans, and so the Druids completely survived intact there until Elizabethan times. So we know a little bit about what the Druids did from what the Irish were doing. But this map here is showing what happened after the Romans left. And as you can see, the green bits there are places of Anglo-Saxon occupation, and the blue bits are still Celtic. And as you can see, the kind of half of the country in 570 AD is still Celtic. Kinra, for instance, still got a Celtic name, but I mean it was within a Celtic kingdom, Penglern. Here, though, these hatched areas are places where things are in contention, and Worcestershire and Gloucestershire were prime targets for the Anglo-Saxon invaders. And one of the sort of Anglo-Saxon groupings, quite a mysterious one as well, is this little one here. Can you see that? A tiny little settlement there in what is now called the Forest of Wychwood, which still bears the name of this tribe. It seems that some small war band broke out of there in about 570, and they overran Cael Badon, this place here, around Bath, and all of the area around Gloucestershire and Worcestershire. And these people were called the Witcher. The H isn't sounded. Now, it's curious, but the word Witcher means witch, it seems, and this has got interesting consequences, which I'm going to come to shortly. But yeah, I've enlarged the map a bit there, just so that you get a sense of kind of how in the balance all this actually was. And these people took over the territory of the Dobunii tribe. So if we could just... Now, this isn't very good. Now, my friend's daughter did all this for me. She's only 14. And at this point, I took my glasses off, and I thought it was, I didn't realise that actually the image is blurred. I apologise for that, but I just want to draw your attention to this book. It's in the Kidderminster Library stock, so you can order it. He's done another book, this fella. His name's Stephen J. Yates. He's an Oxford archaeologist. And this was his kind of life's work, really. And I'll come to why I think that this is a very important bit of work in a minute. But let me just read to you, I think some of you, I don't know if anybody was here 9 years ago when I spoke here last time about Izmir, my first little book that I did way back then. But I mean, we haven't come very far since then, really, because I mean, that was all about this territory which is kind of lost to history, called Izmir. And I kind of always had a sense around that time of something mysterious going on in this neighbourhood. And I'll just come to it. At the turn of the century, I just got back here after being away for pretty much 20 years, I suppose. And I returned to my own tribal roots, where I took up employment with Worcestershire County Council. My work took me up to the hill villages of North Worcestershire, and the contrast with my former urban life was pleasant. My journey home took me via many places I had not seen since my boyhood days, including St Kenelm's Well at Romsley. The ancient rhyme about this place still echoed in my head. In Clent by Cowbach under a thorn lieth Kenelm, king born, his head offshorn. It was about a young prince of Mercia in the 9th century, Kenelm, who was murdered at this spot. He'd received a warning in a dream that he was to die, but was lured out hunting on the Clent hills with his sister's lover Ascobert. Quendrida, the boy's sister, meant the prince harm. She had arranged that Ascobert would murder him, and the lad was dragged to a hawthorn tree, forced to kneel and decapitated. At the moment his head was smitten from his body, a magical spring emerged at the spot. A white dove witnessed the killing and flew to Rome, where it dropped the verse above on the pontiff as he was at his devotions. Cardinals were sent to England, and the boy's body was discovered when magical white animals led the papal legates to the isolated spot. So I've kind of concentrated on this area, and I became aware that the people who ruled the Clent Hills were these people called the Witcher. Clent seems to derive from a word in Old Swedish meaning wooded slopes. When the British chieftains who still controlled Gloucestershire were destroyed at the Battle of Dearden, the Witcher seem to have displaced the former Dobunii tribe. But the word displaced is misleading, for as I have observed, the total numbers of incoming Germanic-speaking folk could not have been very great. So what I think really went on was that the Witcher weren't a kind of mass movement of Germanic people. They were just a small tribal aristocracy that just literally took over from the preceding one. But another thing that they seem to have taken over was a strange cult which had persisted all through the Roman Empire in the neighbourhood of Gloucestershire, and which this fellow, Stephen J. Yates, started to uncover quite a lot of archaeology about this cult of a goddess. Now the curious thing is that at exactly the same time, and with no contact between us at all, I started to have exactly the same idea. And when this book came out, I think it's 2008, could have been slightly after that, I didn't know about it for some time. I just kind of came across it in a library one day and thought, And I'll just read you some of what he says about his discoveries. Yeah. So, Yates proposes that the incoming Witcher essentially constituted a change of management. This cult, he argues, had literally deified the landscape and all its natural features, which they worshipped in the form of a goddess named Kuda, who gave her name to the Cotswolds. This theory is now widely accepted in academic circles as correct. Another pagan goddess with a similar name, Gudda, was worshipped by the pagan merchants to the north. Her name is recalled in the legend of Edric the Wild, an English renegade who resisted the Normans just after the Norman conquest. So the whole area, in fact, Shropshire, was named after this goddess called Guddir, it was actually known as. Localised iconography of three male figures known as genii cucullati have been discovered all across the area. They are depicted as cloaked and hooded devotees worshipping an enthroned goddess, the Matribus et Genio Loci, the mother goddess and the genius of the place. So I already had postulated that, there'd been a survival of goddess worship in the area, and this fellow kind of seems to confirm this. The ancient forests of the area, Arden, Wyre, Kemble, Kingswood, Dean, Morph and Kinver, were the last strongholds of paganism in England. Morph and Kinver had witches' oaks until late medieval times. There were haunts. These were the haunts of animals sacred to the wild hunt, such as the wild boar. Arden is derived from the same root as the Ardennes region of France and Belgium. The name recalls the huntress goddess Diana, whom we encountered in the introduction. So this is all in my latest book. I was intrigued by all this. And some of you might recall, in fact we'll depart now from the Witcher and go on to the next thing. And go back to the Druids. I just think we need to go back to the Druids on a more local level. And when Elaine mentioned, she asked if there were any connections to Salcombe Hill Fort. Well, there may well be, I don't know precisely. But when I started to think about local connections with the Druids, one of the things I started to think about was this phenomena. These things are known as adder eggs. Now, this isn't a very typical example of an adder egg here. This one, I think, is in the British Museum. I think this one probably belonged to some kind of arch-druid type person. But typically, they don't look like this. What they look like is glassy stones with a hole in the middle. And these things were supposed to be talismanic, magical devices which a druid would carry with them. And it was thought that they could peer through the hole in the stone, and literally they would be able to see into the other world and communicate with deities and spirits in that other world. Now, these things are called adder eggs because of a strange story that was told to Pliny the Elder, a 1st century Roman historian, who would have even been elderer had it not been for the eruption of Vesuvius, in which he perished. But what he was very interested in, indeed, was the natural philosophy of the Druids. There are a lot of Romans who really wanted to know what the secrets were and what they were all about. I think somebody spun him a bit of a tale, really, Pliny. But what he was told was this. And it's an unlikely story, but I think there's something behind it. Now, adders, the snakes, don't lay eggs at all. One of the few snakes that don't do that. Instead, what they do is they congregate, and in spring, around about now really, they'll do this thing called an adder dance. And the males will all kind of coagulate together in a writhing mass. And as they do this, a kind of gunk will appear on their skin. And Pliny was told that the Druids had a way of enticing these adders onto some kind of sheet, which they did on May Eve. And then they tossed this sheet into the air and caught this gunk and fashioned it into these strange stones. Now, I can't believe that there was any truth in that, but there's something local about that, of course, because we go on to the next. What we've got here is Kinver Hill Fort. Now, Kinver is famously, a habitat for adders. And when I was a lad, regularly people's dogs or sometimes small children would be stung by an adder, as they used to call it. But it could be that there's something significant about this, because this is a big promontory hill fort, it's known as. So those of you who've been to Kinwall know that on 3 sides, really, there's no work to do, you're already well defended. So it's only on this south side, which is where you need to actually build defences, which they did with this, ditch and bank. It's still pretty substantial today. You can still sprain an ankle on it. That ditch would have been very much deeper, obviously. The embankment would have been higher, and there would have been a palisade and gates and all the rest of it. So I think that I went to a talk, I guess it must have been about 3 or 4 years ago now, where a local archaeologist from Kimber, Ed Simons, gave us a talk. And what he reckons is, this is referred to as an Iron Age hill fort. Well, it's not. It's Bronze Age. In fact, it might even be older than that. And he has used new technology called LiDAR, which is able to penetrate the ground beneath woodland, and has established that there is a huge ritual Bronze Age landscape underneath Kimber there. And it could well be that this place didn't start off with a military purpose at all. It's probably started off with religious purposes in mind. And one of the things that the Druids definitely worshipped was snakes. They were a snake cult, in fact. And when you hear legends about St Patrick in Ireland banishing the snakes from Ireland, it isn't anything to do with snakes, it's to do with serpents. And that word, the prefix "ser," means wisdom. And the Druids were known literally as serpents. So what Patrick had actually done is he banished the Druids really from Ireland, but simply by incorporating them into his new faith, which was Christianity. Now it could be that the Druids were attracted to Kimber for this reason, because adders don't just turn up anywhere. They only turn up on certain forms of heathland, which are rapidly disappearing, unfortunately. So it could be that you know there were connections to the Druids there. And just to the south of this place, only a couple of miles that way, you've got another massive earthwork called the Foss. Now this is really huge earthwork. It's you know, I mean, when you see this LiDAR survey, you can actually see the you know, the scale of this thing underneath. I guess what you call it, Kingswood Park, is it? Kingswood Country Park, just north anyway of the Drakelow Tunnel. Kingswood Country Park, isn't it? Yeah. So that is the actual tribal boundary. So if we just move on to another one. Yeah, I mean, here's another local hill fort here, but this one would have been a hill fort of the Dobunii, and then later of the Witcher, these other people who turned up, which I spoke about earlier. Now this place is absolutely ram-packed full of folklore and legends. In Victorian times, a strange booklet appeared called The Affairs of Hagley. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. It was called, but I mean, nobody really knows who wrote it. It could have been a local antiquarian. But it recorded lots of legends, and ones that I remember from you know, my childhood. One of the legends was that there was an enormous battle fort there, and the folklore is a bit garbled about it. Some people think it was between the Romano-Britons and the Saxons. Other people think it was between the Celtic tribes and the Romans. Now, I don't think it can have been that, because we would know about that. But it could well be that there was some kind of conflict there, because this word, Witchbury, means the burial place of the Witcher. And the legend is that the 28 yew trees in the grove there each represent a fallen warrior that was killed in this battle, which must have taken place, I guess, during the time when these people, the Witcher, established themselves as the new force in Worcestershire. So there's all this there, but then there's another. If you could just another little mystery. Now, some of you might know this story already, but I'll just refresh your memories just in case. Let's see. Yeah, it's a bit of a gruesome tale, actually. So, in April 1943, 4 young boys went out collecting birds' eggs on the Hagley Hall estate of Lord Cobham near to Witchbury Hillfort, a place with very ancient folklore and magical traditions. They came to a large hollowed out tree, a wych elm, which appeared ideal for nests And so one of the boys, Bob Farmer, climbed in and peered inside. He immediately saw a skull and conveyed this news to his companions, shouting, "It's a Mon's skull." In fact, the skull was that of a female, still with hair adhering to it. The boys, fearful to disclose that they'd been trespassing, because they were in fact poaching, it was wartime and they were after a bit of extra food really, they decided they'd keep the discovery a secret, but one of them eventually told his parents. He woke up with nightmares and things like this. The skeleton was removed by the police. They had to literally cut the tree down, because the body was wedged so tightly in. But one of the hands had been chopped off and was discovered slightly away from the tree. Now, the police gave out that maybe a wild animal like a fox or something like that had got into the tree and had removed the hand, but that just doesn't work out. The body was lost, by the way. Nobody knows what happened to it. So, a year after the discovery, strange graffiti began to appear, indicating that someone knew, or wanted others to believe they knew, who the woman was. They read, "Who put Bella down the wych elm at Hagley Wood?" or "Who put Lou Bella in the wych elm?" This question has never been satisfactorily answered. I'll come to some of the theories later on. Now, curiously, in February 1945, not very far away, there was another one of these things. Another possible ritual magical killing took place near to the Rollright stones on the border of Warwickshire and Oxfordshire. Now, a lady called Margaret Murray, who was one of the first ever female anthropologists in Britain, and I think she was supposed to be the first woman as well who ever unwrapped a mummy. So they used to have parties where they'd unwrap mummies in those days. But she had a column in the Daily Mirror, and she became quite obsessed with the idea that some kind of witch cult or pagan cult had survived in this area, and that this lady had been murdered by them and put in this tree, and suggested all sorts of reasons why this might have gone on. The police wouldn't have any of it, and both of those murders, the one near to the Rollright stones and the Bella in the wych elm thing, completely mysterious to this day. Nobody knows, what went on. This graffiti on the right is the original one from 1944, which appeared somewhere around Stourbridge, I think. And obviously, I can't solve that mystery as to who put that one there. But this other one, I might be able to shed a bit of light on that. Because I have to know who put that graffiti there on the Hagley Monument. And it was a punk rock group called Passion Killers. So now you know. I wasn't in it. But yeah, I mean, there clearly are strange kind of threads, really, in the landscape around here, which I kind of I'm somewhat sensitive to. I don't know if other people have kind of had any other experiences similar to my own, but yeah, I definitely got a sense that something odd really is going on in that neck of the woods, which I mentioned in this my latest book. Now, if we just move on a bit, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there is a pagan cult in the area, but for sure there are still ongoing pagan practices going on, because this is St Kenelm's Well at Romsley, up in the Clent Hills there. These things there, these bits of cloth, are called clouty rags or clouty rags. And what people do is they tie them to the tree in the hope that as the cloth disintegrates, the person's health will be restored. This is a very ancient pagan practice. And if you go there today, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of them there. In fact, I put one there. So this place, I mean, is without any doubt, you know, an ancient pagan shrine, older than the church which now stands on it, St Kennel's Church. And the legend about the massive, you know, the murder of the prince there, although it attaches itself to an Anglo-Saxon, in fact that legend is just typically Celtic. You find it exactly. You can go to Ireland and Scotland and you'll find just the same story told about other people. So certainly there are you know, ongoing magical things going on. Now if you go up to the top of that little ridge there, surprisingly this place, which could be in Ireland or rural Wales, is in fact within sight of Birmingham city centre. You can see straight into Birmingham. So, and in Birmingham there was this fella. New movie out, of course, which we can all go and see. The old fella himself. And this image there, that image, all images to do with J.R.R. Tolkien are now owned by New Line Cinema. Now I think at the National Trust, you know, at the Rock Houses in Kinver, had a notion of creating a replica of the Hobbit Hole at the Kinver Caves. But New Line Cinema put the kibosh on that. They didn't want it to happen. At least not without being paid a lot of money, which the National Trust can't afford. But this fellow obviously was aware of all these kind of undercurrents in the landscape. He regularly visited, you know, parts of Worcestershire, the Shire, you know, in the novels, is Worcestershire. I mean, that's the template for it. And you know, the Malvern Hills and the Misty Mountains and all the rest of it. And so obviously he was aware of a kind of magical sort of realm just sort of below our perceptions. And that had an enormous influence, obviously, because Tolkien is one of the best-selling authors of all time. You know, he wasn't alone in noticing these kind of things in the landscape. I mean, there was Houseman, you've got Simon Evans out of Clibberry, you've got Sabine Baring Gould, Francis Brett Young, Bruce Chatwin, on and on and on it goes, you know. Now, I don't think we quite make enough of that, really, in Worcestershire and you know, these parts, really. The kind of cultural heritage that we have right here underneath our feet. And it seems to me sort of slightly odd, really, that people go to a cinema to watch a film made in Hollywood about a place, you know, that they can walk through. I mean, you all probably go walking in it every other week. And I think it's worth, you know, trying to remember that, you know, that this is the magical land, you know. I mean, we're actually in it. And I think we could make more of it, really. And if we just go on. Oh, now. Yeah, I mean, what I think we ought to have really is a celebration day kind of. No, I won't ramble on. No. Now look, I think it's. I mean, I did this presentation, or rather, Lola did it for me, my friend's daughter. Way back when, before I knew Robert was going to be with us today. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Tolkien and all of those, this whole literary and magical inheritance that we have here in the landscape was a big influence on Robert. Is that fair to say?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
From childhood, my parents took me all up and down the marches, and I lived as a child maybe 1.5 miles from Kenelm's Well.
Right.
And of course, Christianity is a magnificent, it carries 1,000,000 shrouds, so it drops its little moniker on top of everything that was there before. But you know, for me as a kid, I was lucky to be brought up in the 50s where I could actually explore without being bombarded by external forces of television and computer theories and the whole idea of I was left to my own devices. So I had a great childhood. My dad had one of the most dodgy cars that ever came out of Tipton, which was welded every weekend by his father, so that we could go further and further into the marches and just explore. And after a while, you can actually, after 70 years of doing that, you can see all the different moves in the landscape, and then you go to the connections with Alfred Watkins from Hereford and John Seymour, and just the remarkable area that we live in. We move so fast now that sometimes we drive past these brown signs with white writing that tell us something very, very interesting and ancient is all around us. And I went away from here 2 or 3 times, and I don't know whether it was a brewery in Browley Hill or the connections with Baggins Wood over in beyond Bugley and back of the Clee Hill. All these places just still really resonate. Unfortunately, at the same time as I was finding all that stuff out, or later on when I could put it to music, there was a huge cult of British rock which took it and just played with it to such a degree that it denigrated it until it became almost farcical, and I had to go and hide and take no responsibility for the number of guys with double-bladed axes that used to career around Wolverhampton Civic Hall. But you're right, and it's a good job that you're doing this sort of thing, because I think everybody in this room already feels it anyway.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, perhaps after the break, which is short, we can you know, get a bit more discursive about things and talk things over. Just to remind you folks that I've got my new book out now. The funny thing is, this is a true story. I actually ordered some of it just in case anybody wanted to buy it. And they can't give me any because they've sold out. They've sold out. So I've only got one, but I've got other books that I've been writing. So I've been busy writing, but not doing much, you know, in the way of talks and things like that. So very honoured to be here. It's very kind of everyone to have come along and listen.